Manius Otacilius Crassus, Consul 263 and 246 B.C.E. Manius Otacilius Crassus was the first member of the plebeian gens Otocilia to hold the consulship. Due to his relative lack of clout when compared to members of more renowned families, we know nothing about Otacilius' career prior to his first election to the consulship. His family had Samnite roots, though it is hard to estimate how many years removed the Otocilia were from their Samnite heritage. Otacilius' age and rise through the ranks of the Senate means that he must have served both as a soldier and a magistrate in the late phases of Rome's conquest of peninsular Italy, fighting Etruscans, Samnites, and Greeks. Otacilius reached the consulship in 263, and he shared the office with a patrician colleague, Manius Valerius Maximus Corvinus. In 263, Rome decided to capitalize on the success of Appius Claudius Caldex's campaign and sent both of its new consuls to Sicily with full armies of 20,000 men, thus giving them a combined total of 40,000 men. This must have been a great relief to Otacilius, since otherwise the Senate would have surely sent his patrician colleague if they had been forced to choose between the two men. The primary goal of the campaign was to neutralize Hiero and the Syracusans, since they seemed to be the bigger threat than the Carthaginians who dominated the western side of the island. Immediately upon the arrival of the two new consuls, Sicilian cities began to weigh their options and decide which of the three factions they would side with. At that moment, the Romans with their 40,000 man force were a clear and present danger to any city not aligned with Rome. So, according to Diodorus Siculus, 67 cities joined the Roman cause without a fight. With a clear path from Messana, provisions being supplied by their new local allies, and a large enough force to invest the large and heavily fortified city of Syracuse, Valerius and Otacilius decided to march straight to the heart of the strongest Greek polis in the west. When they arrived on the frontier of Syracuse's territory, the Romans quickly stormed one of the frontier fortresses and seemed to have made quite an impression on Hiero. Hiero II of Syracuse in 263 was still aligned with the Carthaginians, who had promised to send a relief force if and when the Romans laid siege to Syracuse. In addition, the Romans as of yet lacked a fleet which was the equal of the Syracusan fleet, and they could by no means blockade the city's harbor to starve it out. Like any Syracusan patriot, Hiero was no doubt aware of how formidable his native city was to any would-be besieger, and he knew that even the great Athenian expedition of 415 BCE had fallen short in the end. Nonetheless, Hiero was a tyrant, and like every dictator in history, his first concern was to remain dictator. With that end in mind, Hiero wanted to avoid a painful siege which could generate dissatisfaction with his leadership. We must also consider that the long history of strife between Syracuse and Carthage most likely made Hiero think it unwise to rely too heavily upon Carthaginian assistance. To the possible surprise of the two Roman consuls, Hiero actually opened negotiations with them when they entered his territory. For Otacilius and Valerius, Hiero's willingness to become an ally of Rome was little less than a godsend, as with their lack of a viable fleet, their efforts to take Syracuse by siege would have been in vain, and such an operation would leave them vulnerable to the Carthaginians while also lessening the fear that the other cities of Sicily would have for Rome, and increasing the probability of revolts breaking out. It is not clear how long the negotiations took or how hard of a line either side took, but it seems that because peace between Rome and Syracuse suited the interest of Hiero and the two consuls so neatly, that the process was smooth and rapid. Hiero agreed to release all of his Roman prisoners, and he may have led off the negotiations with this gesture to establish goodwill with the consuls. As an ally of Rome, Hiero promised to aid Roman operations in Sicily with logistical and military aid, thus resolving Rome's supply problems that stemmed from a lack of a fleet to connect the four legions in Sicily with Italy. In exchange, Rome legitimated Hiero by recognizing him as a king, and recognizing his right to rule over the cities of Acre, Leontini, Megara, Netum, and Halorum, all of which formed a kind of semicircular perimeter around Syracuse. The Romans even went so far as to return the city of Tauromenium on a high plain between Messana and Catana. Hiero's position as the ruler of Syracuse was now fully secure, And unlike his predecessors, he was not forced to worry about the proverbial sword of Damocles for the rest of his life. While it may seem like Hero got the better end of the deal, in the long run, the Romans clearly benefited more than their new Greek ally. For the duration of the First Punic War, which would rage on until 241, Hero would prove to be a loyal ally and provide crucial supplies of Roman forces, even during periods when Rome was at a low ebb and Hero could have struck out on his own or sided with Carthage and attempted to oust the Romans. In fact, Hero would remain loyal to the Romans for the remaining 48 years of his long life, which only ended in 215 B.C.E. This, of course, also means that the negotiations of Valerius and Otacilius in 263 were effective enough to keep Hero loyal even after Lake Trasimene and Cannae, two of the worst land disasters in Roman history some decades later. One could plausibly argue that the negotiations of 263 were more important than any single battle fought during the entirety of the First Punic War because of the long-reaching and positive impact that this alliance had on the course of Roman history. The negotiations were initiated and concluded at an ideal time for the Romans, as the Carthaginians had almost assembled their relief force in time to intervene. However, when they heard that Hero was talking with the Romans, the Carthaginian commander decided that Hero was a faithless ally and decided to preserve his mercenary force for other operations. There's a very high probability that this was the force that Hannibal commanded the following year at Agrigentum. Unlike his patrician colleague Valerius, who earned a cognomen and a triumph, Otacilius does not seem to have gained any special credit for the achievements of 263. Given the nature of the military and diplomatic activities of that year, it would appear that the Senate bent the normal rules of what is required to receive a triumph more than a little bit to award Valerius, since it seems extraordinarily unlikely that the Roman army defeated 5,000 or more foreign opponents during the consulship of Valerius and Otacilius. The honors accorded to Valerius imply that he was more important to the negotiations with Hero and that the Mamertines of Messana had some sort of special relationship with Valerius that Otacilius did not have. Our sources give us no indication of any strife between the two consuls, so they presumably agreed with each other on the direction of their campaign. In the absence of other evidence, it seems likely that Valerius being rewarded while Otacilius was ignored is yet another case of the Senate as a body showing favoritism toward patricians at the expense of plebeians. Another factor that may have worked against Otacilius is his Samnite heritage, since many of the senators undoubtedly had outstanding grievances with the Samnites due to the many years of bloody warfare between Rome and the Samnites in the decades prior to the First Punic War. In 246, Manius Otacilius Crassus was elected to a second term as consul. By this point, the First Punic War had evolved into a far different conflict than the one that he had helped to initiate during the war's formative stages. While the alliance with Hero had held and Rome held the upper hand in the conflict as a whole, the war had devolved into a bloody stalemate. The census of 247, the year before Otacilius' second term, showed that the number of Roman citizens had dropped by 17%, with similar losses being very likely for Rome's allies in Italy. In 248, having soured on naval adventures, which often resulted in devastating casualties and the loss of expensive warships, the Romans had refocused on the land component of the warfare, and Roman forces had initiated sieges of Lilybaeum and Drepana, Carthage's two most important Sicilian strongholds. The following year, Carthage's brilliant general Hamilcar Barca had arrived and managed to prevent the Roman offensive from making any further progress. In 246, Otacilius and his patrician colleague Marcus Fabius Licinus arrived in Sicily and continued the land battle. This is a particularly poorly recorded portion of the war, as none of our records on the First Punic War have much to say about this year. Given the dearth of evidence, it is safe to assume, as Adrian Goldsworthy does, that there were only small-scale land battles and no major naval clashes during the entire year. Both sides were relatively exhausted and lacked the will and resources to mount a major offensive. Based on the reputation that Hamilcar Barca established as Carthage's premier general, we can also assume that he got the better of both Otacilius and Fabius over the course of the year's campaigning. Manius Otacilius Crassus was a two-time consul, but glory and fame eluded him during both of his terms in office. The first time, his patrician colleague stole the spotlight. The second time, he had to face the greatest land commander that either side produced during the First Punic War, and he was unable to pull off a signal achievement to cement his name among Rome's greats. Nonetheless, Otacilius was not responsible for any lost fleets, and so he was far from the worst Roman leader during a war that produced more than a few incompetent generals.